Good. Okay.
Don't be best friends.
All right. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. For those, I think everybody in this room knows who I am, but there are people out on Google Hangout that don't. So my name is Yasmin Abdulevin. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science. And I would like to thank Jared Wesley for taking the initiative of linking the Department of Political Science and members of the department and students here with members of the Alberta Civil Service across the river. Jared's really been at the forefront of pioneering this idea of pracademics, of sort of intermixing academia and practical application of political science. And many of the people in the Department of Political Science are engaged in what might also be called policy-relevant research. That is research that bridges the insights of scholarship with concerns facing policymakers and builds bridges to exchange different knowledges held by academics, held by policymakers, and held within civil society. So whatever the term we may use to describe this, the point is that the Department of Political Science supports these kinds of exchanges, and we really look forward to input and questions from folks hooked up on Google Hangout. And also, I think we hope to continue to build the kind of initiative we see here today, given what we can do with the new technologies. So it's my distinct pleasure today to be introducing Richard Johnston. He's here as a kind of fringe benefit, it might be called, and that's because his daughter, Ellen Johnston, has written a play that's being staged at Edmonton's Fringe Festival this week. And
Don't worry, there's a plug coming.
Okay, yeah, there's a plug coming, so you'll hear more about that. But besides being a dad, he's also a professor of political science and Canada Research Chair at University of British Columbia in the Department of Political Science. He has been awarded numerous professorships and directorships and very prestigious fellowships from institutions that span continents, and it includes Harvard University, where he held the Mackenzie King Professorship of Canadian Studies in 1994 to 1995. It includes the University of Pennsylvania, where he served as the director of the National Annenberg election study between 2006 and 2009. And most recently, it's included the European University Institute in Florence through a very prestigious Marie Curie research fellowship, which is funded through the Commission of the European Union. So these many high-level awards and prizes are really testimony to his enormous contributions to our collective understanding of politics, of political parties, and elections in Canada and in other liberal democracies. And this is a result of an oeuvre that includes many articles and many books dealing with Canadian elections, with American elections, with campaigning, with social capital, the welfare state, democracy, multiculturalism, and also survey methodology. Since I'm doing this introduction, I also want to add a personal note, because I really came to know Dick Johnston better when he served as president of the Canadian Political Science Association in 2007-2008, because that was the time period that I was a member of the board of the CPSA, and I really saw firsthand how tirelessly and energetically he worked to professionalize the association in this country, to increase the way it offered services and to function better for the benefit of the profession in all of this country. And also be forever grateful, I think you know this, but I'll say it publicly here, that he volunteered his tremendous methodological skills and knowledge, which a team of us really relied on heavily in survey work done for the Diversity Task Force of the Canadian Political Science Association. So all this is to say that Dick Johnston is really somebody who has not only made major contributions to political science research and knowledge, of which you're going to hear today, but he has also been someone that has contributed greatly to the political science profession. And now, therefore, I'm very pleased to welcome him to the department to speak today. So the plan is he's going to speak for about 45 minutes. And we'll have time after that for questions. And I'm going to be sort of fielding the questions from people in here, and Jared Wesley will be fielding questions from across the river. So Dick's talk today is entitled An Analytical History of the Canadian Party System. So I'm going to turn the floor over to him.
Thanks, Yasmin. So first of all, what Yasmin hasn't told you is that my presidency helped ruin her life. One consequence of which is she got to be the local organizer for the second of the two standalone CBSA conferences, and I, in my view, the most successful CBSA conference in the history of the association. But it also revealed certain flaws in the design, I guess you could say, and the association has regretted that initiative, I guess.
Not because of me.
Well, no, absolutely not. Anyway, that's another story. I think probably I should go to slides now, so if you want to do that. Okay, so first of all, this is the plug. You have to put up with this. This is why I'm in Edmonton in the first place. My daughter threw in a proposal to the 4 Alberta and BC fringes and got on the Edmonton and the Vancouver programs. It's an amazing thing. This is a 65-minute presentation. It has 5 original musical pieces and 65 minutes of vocalizing, which is crazy. It is a high-wire act and a physically athletic act, and it is an expression of gutsiness, the like of which I would think nobody in this room has ever ventured, certainly not me. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as bad as the grade 10 exam for the Royal Conservatory. So there you are. So it's at the Fringe. I'm more than happy to talk about it after if you want to ask. But here's the title. So why am I talking about analytic history? So it's, first of all, it's a working title. It is the working title of a manuscript that is almost complete in form to submit to publishers. It's not a very good title. I don't know even that it's 100% descriptive of what actually is going on, and I'm open to suggestion so that this or some version of this could become the subtitle. But it's analytical in the sense that it responds to analytical propositions in the comparative politics literature in particular. Okay, but it's not as if somehow I have a central theorem that I pretend to explain everything, which is kind of the new mode of comparative institutionalist study. But it does respond to claims made by people whose central propositions are analytically motivated, typically through some kind of game theory. But it's also analytical in the sense that there's a pretty heavy dose of sort of I would hope you would take it seriously as sort of the logic of exploration and discovery. But it is actually a body of propositions about the history of the Canadian party system that that amongst other things say that there's actually several competing logics in play, and those logics have analytical characteristics. So it's also, I would say, old stuff. Right? This is stuff that Lightbody and I would talk about 40 years ago. Right? Questions that kind of went off the screen in the 80s. They went off the screen because other questions came to the fore. They went off the screen because there was, I think, a considerable amount of frustration over the kind of intractability of the Canadian system to any kind of simple explanation. And it partly went off the screen for reasons in which I would be one of the culprits. The accumulation of survey data directed us towards very individualistic modes of analysis and away from aggregate issues, to the point that by the turn of the millennium, people were making propositions about aggregate phenomena on the basis of individual evidence, even though in fact they were woefully ignorant of the history in the background of these. So it is in some sense that some of this is an expression of what I would describe as Durkheimian impatience with my own craft. This is quite a Durkheimian story you're going to get here. It really is pretty much dedicated to the proposition that if you've got aggregate outcomes, you need aggregate independent variables, although there's lots of trafficking through individual stuff to get there. It's also the case that thanks partly to the accumulation of survey data, but also through the accumulation of methods that weren't available at the start of my career, but also, frankly, the accumulation of facts. The I shudder to think, but something like a third of the electoral history of Canada post-Confederation took place in my adult life. And so it is remarkable the extent to which the empirics of the study of the Canadian party system continues to depend on propositions fronted, for example, by Alan Cairns, on the basis of electoral history, that is, than which more years have passed since the paper was published than are encompassed in the paper itself. Right? So to a certain extent, history has delivered us more stuff, and part of what I argue is that the more recent history helps us understand the earlier. So that's part of what's going on here. I would say it's also provoked by the fact that, on one hand, the Canadian elections and the party system are the surest soporific to non-Canadian editors for presses. I have this distinct memory of standing with my colleague Henry Brady from Berkeley, for some time president of the American Political Science Association, one of the greats of political methodology, talking to Naomi Schneider of University of California Press, this is 25 years ago, trying to sell Letting the People Decide to Cal, and Naomi saying, why would I want to buy a book on Canada? And as she was saying this, over her shoulder, my eye fell on a book on Burkina Faso, and I thought, what? But this is a fact of publishing life, and publishers know what they're talking about. It's very hard to sell a book on Canada. It's much easier to sell a book on Australia or New Zealand, for example, in the US than a book on Canada. And I think there's a reason why this is so, that the Canadian case is, in fact, a critical case, a deviant case, and part of what I'm selling here is a deviant case analysis. It is a case that requires a higher level of narrative preparation than is the case for most of the party systems that we would think of as the usual comparators. An American, let's face it, that's the audience, right? That's the political science community that has a large enough membership to justify production runs for book publishers in comparative politics. An Australian, or rather an American audience, can kind of walk into Australian politics and kind of get it more or less, get it enough, because the basics of the system are aligned on questions that are familiar enough. Class relations, inequality, welfare state, labor unions, stuff like that, right? Same for New Zealand, same for UK. And so I think that there's a sense in which then that they're reliant on us in the Canadian community to kind of lead them into it, but we have a propensity with the kind of the Selkirk toast, who's like us, nobody's like us, here's to us. Well, frankly, that's a prescription for having no one paying attention to you. We've been so provincial, so focused on ourselves, and wallowing in our distinctiveness as if this is a virtue. And instead of presenting the distinctiveness as something itself to be accounted for in a manner that helps underpin just how contingent much of the stuff that is taken as necessary in comparative politics. But there are a few cases in which the Canadian party system has occasioned serious comparative attention. The problem is that, in my view, those comparative works, careful though they are, and respectful of the facts though they are, nonetheless misrepresent the case, or at least underrepresent the case, and leave massive amounts of explanatory fodder left around. So, for example, Peter Ordership and his colleagues on federalism, right? So, very respectful, really trying to take the history seriously. But somehow or another, you come out of Ordership and Shvetsova and Filipov concluding that we have a massive divergence between federal and provincial party systems because of disagreement over the amendment formula and in anticipation of the Statute of Westminster. And that actually, the question of federal ownership of prairie lands was a central issue. Of course, it was a central issue of politics, but it's not why we have divergent party systems. Or, most famously, a book that's won many awards, and is a great book, by Pradeep Chibber and Ken Coleman. Canada is one of the 4 party systems in that book. That book is an important emendation on what is the most highly cited and most important book in the study of party systems, Gary Cox's Making Votes Count, in addition to Cox's dissertation book on the efficient secret, that presents Canada as the deviant case that helps us understand the nationalization of party systems. The problem with that book is it's wrong on central facts and ignores at least 50% of the story. In fact, in my view, the Canadian case is an even bigger anomaly. It's not, it's not merely the exception that proves their rule. It's a whole other body of exceptions, and I'll spend some time on this. And in some ways, it was that book and Pradeep's very respectful presentation of it to UBC audience, in which he paid his own way to Vancouver to have us comment on it, that has provoked a lot of the rest of this book. The provocation got me to think hard about certain questions, and thinking hard about those questions, realized that if I could answer that one, I was going to answer a bunch more questions as well. And so the result of this is this still somewhat sprawling manuscript, and I think what you'll see is a somewhat sprawling presentation that is addressed to those questions. So let's move on. So these are puzzles that I choose to highlight. They're familiar enough to people who know the story of the Canadian party system. So you have on one hand this the long liberal century, I'll call it, right? 70 of 100 years in the 20th, or 80 of 110 from 1896 to 2006. It's not the most dominant party in the Western world, but it's among them. André Blais, in his presidential address 2005, characterized as one of the four most successful political parties in electoral history. Ken Carney, working with brokerage parties and dominant parties, puts it somewhere up there as well. So it is clear it's one of the most successful political operations. And what's striking is when you try to actually do some numbers on this, it's not just that they governed so long and been out of power so little. It's that whatever they stand for, we know who they are. There has been no break in the continuity of this party's organizational identity virtually since Confederation. Whereas if you look at the comparable numbers for the dominant parties in the UK, New Zealand, or Australia, part of it's a parade of names, right? But these are parties that only congealed in their present form typically in the 30s, whereas the Liberals go back to pre-Confederation in a manner of speaking. So long liberal century, but resting on archaic foundations, at least it used to be, right? And foundations which at one level are not so different from the rest of the world. The problem is we can't actually figure out what the basis of that is. And I'm talking here about the historic Catholic versus non-Catholic cleavage in the vote. And I'll show you just, well, we'll come back to it. The other peculiarity of this long liberal century is that the Liberals, at least after 1950, but actually, well, or after 1935, depending which dimension you're talking about, is they're a party of the center. We've often thought, well, that's why they're so successful, because they're a party of the center, because after all, that's where the voters are. And I don't doubt that at some level, that is a good thing from the point of view of liberal longevity. The problem is, it doesn't work that way anywhere else, certainly not in the Westminster world, right? That there are centripetal tendencies in electoral systems. If you have consolidated parties competing for office, where office is held by single parties, there are strong Downsian centripetal tendencies, but those are centripetal tendencies that operate on a framework where the parties originate off-center, and they're dealing with their off-center bases. And indeed, it is those off-center bases that lead to their being privileged actors in the game. The centripetal stuff comes incidentally in the requirement for elections. It's absolutely unusual in a Westminster system, and generally unusual, for a party of the center to be the dominant player in the game. So that's something to account for, and part of that actually was persuade you that they are a centrist party. And then, of course, there's the fact that the liberal century is maybe over, is probably over, certainly maybe over. And it seems to me, if you can account for its longevity, you have to be able to account for its collapse, and vice versa. It's premature to say collapse, but leave that as it. And then the other thing that captures the eye is that the competitive nature of Canadian elections is unbalanced. Right? It may have become balanced in the last decade, but certainly down to 2006 it was unbalanced in the sense that that the flip side of liberal dominance is this volatility. Right? Canadian elections are thought of as peculiarly volatile. The fact of the matter is, if you just look at a distribution, run a histogram or a kernel density function, the fact is, Canadian elections aren't that volatile. The median swing over the typical election pair in Canada is about what you find in the other Westminster comparators. The outlier is actually Australia and the U.S. House. They're extraordinarily stable. But the difference is that the Canadian system has this long tail, right? And we have episodic volatility. So when we get the big changes, they're on a scale that's practically off the scale, and what's more, it has this recurring pattern to it, right? That as I'll show you in a minute, we have this picture of recurring volatility. The other thing is fragmentation. Ours was the first Westminster system to have enduring multi-party competition, and the anomalous point that I want to make is that a large part of that fragmentation is absolutely inconsistent with the way in which Duverger has been accepted into the comparative politics literature, largely through the work of Gary Cox. The canonical form of local competition in Canada has been three-party competition. That's not supposed to happen. Okay. The last 2 points: historically weak class basis, still weak. Why is that? I don't think it's actually. This is the kind of counterfactual question. It's not obvious at all why it should be weak. Actually, most of the standard explanations for its weakness don't add up comparatively, but I think you can supply an explanation. Federal-provincial discontinuity. Unquestionably, we are by far the outlier in terms of the lack of connection between federal and provincial party systems. Not in every province and not in every period, but on average, we are the outlier. Even the ethno-national parts of the increasingly federalizing Spain have nothing like the kind of federal-provincial discontinuities that have been common in certain Canadian provinces, and not necessarily Canadian provinces that have any kind of ethno-national claim. BC, Alberta. Okay, so to move on. So explanatory themes. First of all, then, a big part of the story is that we are the one. We are in comparative politics terms a deeply divided society. We may not be shooting each other, but there is a sense in which historically we have had the nation within the nation, a distinctive set of claims that you would think, at least, would be difficult to reconcile with the low detail, simple majoritarianism of the framework. Right? We have pretty much the simplest Westminster framework going, apart from the fact that it is a federation. Okay? And so, in this, though, one of the critical things is that Quebec has been the pivot for governance. This is part of the folklore, but in fact, you need to go beyond the folklore and actually say, what does it mean for that to be the case? And it can't be the pivot just by itself, but nonetheless, it's been the pivot. At the same time, however, what we've had is the logic of Westminster parliamentarism produces countrywide contestation and drifts towards the nationalization of electoral forces. Right? Directly contrary to the claims that rule the roost with Alan Cairns' 1968 article. Alan is just dead wrong at some level about how the system works. There's a powerful inclusive logic in Westminster, in the electoral system, and in the expectations of single-party governments. At the same time, however, that logic runs against sectional resistance, and so we have a pushback where periodically that nationalizing logic meets resistance, and at that point, Cairns comes in and is dead right, because where there is localized resistance, the electoral system magnifies its impact. Right? So there's a sense which is a kind of a Cairns and an anti-Cairns going on here, parallel universes or something. And there's an explosive dynamic within the old system itself, and indeed that may have killed the old system. Okay, so that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that not all quote-unquote new parties are the same. We kind of know this, but it is still true that in the texts there's this talk about kind of new parties, third parties, one of which is the NDP. The NDP is not like the other parties. The NDP, I would argue, it's a Labour party, damn it. You know, when you live in BC, it's very clear that that's what it is. Don't talk to me about co-ops in Saskatchewan, president. It's a Labour party. And it was a Labour party pretty much from its origins, pretty much everywhere that it appeared, except Saskatchewan in a way. It has a very different dynamic. Well, Saskatchewan now, but not there. A very different dynamic electorally from all the other players. Right? And so that's part of it. All the others are a mixed bag. But for my purposes, at least, the element in the others the commonality in the others that I want to emphasize is that they have call it what you will, the names are consequential. They have insurgent niche anti-system elements, not always, not all the time. And indeed, some of these critical parties are more things than one. Reform, in some ways, being the biggest example. When Reform burst on the scene in '93, we thought of it, I refused to call it a protest party. It was a protest, it was a policy protest. But when Reform burst on the scene in '93, we thought of it as, at least many of us thought of it as an insurgent of some form or another. With hindsight, it's the midwife of the political realignment that Preston Manning, speaking through his father, advocated 45 years ago in the book Political Realignment. That it's, in fact, it's the midwife, possibly, of an ideologization, and one might say, from a comparative point of view, normalization of Canadian politics. But it was also that other stuff, right? It was, in its origins, yet another expression of Western regional sentiment. So it was many different things. But it is that insurgent element that I want to emphasize as common thread for all the others. And that the interaction of the quote-unquote new parties with the rest of the system differs between the NEP and all the others. Okay? And then a point that's going to run through all of this is that my argument presupposes, and I hope demonstrates, that you can't understand the phenomenon without imputing to voters strategic reckoning at the level of whole electorates. Right? Most of the study of strategic voting, and again this is Cox and others, says it's a local phenomenon. Where does one actually win or lose locally? I'm arguing no. It may not satisfy the canons of expected utility maximization and all of that, but empirically, it's pretty clear that voters pay attention to the strategic positions of parties in the electorate as a whole. Right? And this is actually critical because provincial elections help us understand federal elections. This is sort of what I was saying, Jared, 5 months ago, right? That provincial elections, in some ways, are the counterfactual for federal elections, and vice versa, in the sense that provincial electorates are the whole electorate for provincial elections. But provincial electorates are not the whole electorate for federal elections. Okay? So, but the general point that there's strategic reckoning at the level of whole electorates is a kind of an insurgent point, and it's basically taking Gary Cox and his acolytes on. So I'm already been at this for 20 minutes, and I haven't got to. Let me see if I can get through some of these slides at least. So point one, the episodic volatility, right? So if you actually start to look at volatility comparatively, you realize just how peculiar it is. So these are Pedersen volatility values. It's the change from election to election, the percentage of the electorate that have to move between parties to transform one result into the other. Okay. And then I put as a low S smoother in there to kind of dramatize the patterns. Everywhere else, if you look at where the big volatility numbers are, they're before the Second War. They're part of the transition to class politics. Much of it is the maneuvering on the center and the right to identify which is the strategically privileged alternative to the party of the left, or as they finally settle their differences and merge up. There's a slightly odd story with Australia because there's delaying labor in the 30s, so actually labor itself fractured in the 30s and then knit itself back together somewhere around the time the bridge was finished, I guess. But in Canada, it says volatility is as great post-war as pre. Okay? The ultimate result being 93. I mean, Canada in 93 beat even Italy in the same period for overall transformation. And although I won't dwell on it further here, the point is that there is this kind of recurring cycle of volatility. That if you look at whether the volatility moment permanently alters the system or not, usually it doesn't actually. You get this massive shift and then a massive shift back. That's massively oversimplifying, but I'll show you some what this means. So that's a kind of volatility story. That's one avenue to the question. Now, this volatility story, to account for it, you actually have to have the liberal domination in there. So, just to make a point, Quebec is the pivot. Right? So this is a kind of a necessary sufficiencies table. It actually comes out of the programming for QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, an attempt to actually use Boolean algebra to account for qualitative stuff. but I don't actually buy QCA, but there is a sense in which it sets you up to talk about kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for qualitative shifts. In this case, the qualitative shift is the delivery of government to the Liberals or not, as the case may be, and how critical is it to control Quebec. What I'm not showing you here is some stuff on distributions of votes and seat-vote relations in Quebec. The seat-vote relation in Quebec is entirely garden variety. It's not special. What's special about Quebec is the volatility of the vote itself. Okay, and that Quebec voters before '93 at least tended to agglomerate to one or the other of the parties of government and deliver 80% or more of the seats from the province to that party. Quebec was big enough that 80% or more of the seats of that party put that party 40% or more of the way to a single party majority. Right? That's the key. That in most Canadian elections, the Liberals got to start halfway to the finish. So it's pretty hard to beat them under those circumstances. It requires an exceptional concatenation of forces, and ultimately it requires taking Quebec away. But this is an attempt to actually sort of put that on paper, get some sense. And so if you look at the top box there where it says necessary ? So what happens if they don't get 20% or more? If it's necessary, they should never win if they don't get 20% or more of the seats of Quebec. And basically, it's only happened a couple of times in this period. When they don't get, I should say that it's happened 11. When they don't get that, they don't win. The one exception is 1963, where they came that close. They got 18% of the seats from Quebec, and it was a weak minority government. First Pearson. The flip side is, what happens if you do get that 20% or more? Is it sufficient? And it's pretty close to sufficient. If you also get Ontario, it's sufficient. That's not just Quebec. That's also the size of Ontario. But even if you don't, even if the only province that the Liberal Party extracts 20% or more of the seats in the House of Commons from, they win 4 times in 5. And they win even when they don't get comparable numbers of seats from Ontario over the long haul. I don't have any red circles around the Conservative side. The Conservative story is more complex. The West is relevant for the Conservatives in a way that it never has been for the Liberals. I mean, the Liberals were strong in the West early on, but the West, not for long. And the West was for most of the early years, of course, was relatively inconsequential in America. But the Conservatives are a more complicated story. But even for the Conservatives, winning Quebec is a good thing, no question about it, at least in the short-term sense. This one, I'm just going to go and point something. So this is just simply, the dark line is how big a share of the national total in the House comes from a particular province or region. Right, that's the dark line here to one party or the other. Okay, and then this is the share. The basic point is that Quebec adjudicates the great transformation of the system around the turn of the century, the 20th century. And it's almost a one-to-one relationship until you hit 1900. Then as the West fills up, actually they accumulate additional seats in the West. But over the century, almost sort of 4/5 of every 4 out of every 5 elections or so, the Liberals are above this magic 20% threshold. And pretty much every time, not every time, but pretty much every time, they win. And the Conservatives are down here. But note, 1911, 1930, 1958, and 1984-88, right? So that Quebec is even important, and I'll dramatize this again, to the Conservative breakthroughs to majority status. That the Conservatives typically can't get into power in any form if they don't, given this dominance in Quebec. But if they're to gain majority status in this system down to 93, they have to get a significant breakthrough relative to the baseline in Quebec. The other provinces, I'm not going to dwell on, you know the story, mostly. The only point I would emphasize is for Ontario, that before 1960, Ontario in some sense was the great frustrated player, because the Liberals rarely extracted from Ontario the big numbers, except when in some sense they had kind of national landslides, so it wasn't really getting Ontario in a good way, it was kind of just getting lots of seats everywhere. So, but in the first, there's a critical period in here in which the Conservatives have massive control of Ontario, and they still can't win. Okay? After 1960, Ontario starts to kick in as hugely important. Then what you see is that the big numbers in Quebec really start to matter, because, for example, over the 70s, as the Liberal base outside Quebec eroded, the biggest and most consequential erosion was in Ontario, and ditto for the Conservatives in an opposite way. So I better hurry up here. I've got a couple slides here to make the point about the Liberal Party as the party of the centre. So this is campaign manifesto project data, and the point here is that this is essentially machine language at work. Just counting mentions in platforms. It's what we have for the longitudinal and comparative study of party platforms. And if you look at sort of before 1960, it's not so much that they're centrist as that it's a completely different dimension. That the Liberals and the Conservatives on the kind of standard left-right stuff are indistinguishable. And they're both contrasted against the NDP. So to the extent that there's a sort of economic social dimension, it's the CCF actually that is opening it up. But after 1960, the Conservatives pull to the right, and this is part of a trend that we're living with. The NDP more or less kept in place, and the Liberals, if you just ran a trend through that, right, the Liberals go from being indistinguishable, or perhaps even a little bit to the right of the Conservatives, to being quite close to the NDP. And that's part of the story of the kind of electoral coalition, all the rest of it stuff that gets Alvin Finkel dismissed from the NDP and all that. This is the other dimension, Quebec and Canada, right? And this is survey evidence, starting with the '88 Canadian election study and down to the present. And in that '88 instance, we had this question about how much do you think should be done for Quebec? Much more than at present, more than at present, about the same as now, less, much less. Okay, very crude question. It's very diagnostic. And this is where supporters of the parties place themselves. Right? That's the only way you can really get at this. And the critical thing here, the solid black line is from '88 to 2011 is where Liberals place themselves. To the left is anti-Quebec, to the right is pro-Quebec, rest of Canada versus Quebec itself. Not surprisingly, Quebecers think more should be done for Quebec, regardless of their party support. In general, outside Quebec, people kind of think that should be done for Quebec, regardless of party support. The critical thing is, however, that election after election, the major competitor to the Liberals is on its outer flank. Right? More anti-Quebec outside Quebec, more pro-Quebec inside Quebec. The Liberal Party is the party, the Liberal base at least, is the base of the center. This does not require the party to be inconsistent with itself, and indeed on this question, it's the most coherent party. The least coherent was the Conservatives under Mulroney, who inherited an anti-Quebec base and welded to it an extremely nationalist base inside Quebec, producing an extraordinarily effective government, but one that had the explosive potential right inside. Okay. The other party that looks like that, of course, is the NDP. NDP may be changing, but you know that even actually in 1988 there was a respectable NDP vote in Quebec. It was a separatist vote, and it required Ed Broadbent to lie through his teeth repeatedly, basically, to deal with a degree of internal incoherence that fully rivaled that for Mulroney, the Conservatives. It's just that Bragg had to deal with a real Quebec base rather than the fake one. But the point is, the Liberals have always had the major competitor inside and outside Quebec on its outer flank. In that sense, party of the center on the national dimension. Okay? And this actually goes to the point, taking it further back. I'm going to take you back to the 19th century through survey and election data, kind of to amplify this point, but also to show its transformation. So this is survey data, and it's It's just it's the difference between, in this case, between francophones and all others, outside Quebec and inside Quebec. I'm not claiming that this is the fundamental division within either place. It's a diagnostic to try and dramatize the groups that in some sense would have similar positions on a common question. So if you look at the Liberals, for example, the rest of Canada lines are in gray for both parties, and then the black lines are for Quebec. The data sources are the Canadian election study 65 to the present, and Gallup polls back to the 40s. So I've got this massive Gallup merged file. And the earliest available machine-readable Gallup polls are from two during the 1945 campaign, which asked how you voted in 1940. So we can kind of reconstruct back to 1940. And at least once we hit the 40s, the gap between francophones inside and outside Quebec is very wide for the Liberals. So this is francophones versus non-francophones in Quebec versus francophones versus non-francophones outside. So for example, back to 68, Marcel Ferrero, the two societies. Okay, this is the arrival. This is the arrival of the Mulrooney coalition and then the Bloc. Okay. On the other hand, francophones outside, disproportionately liberal. And the Conservatives are messier. They're kind of the flip side, and they're messy. But the point is that both parties carry different meanings for francophones inside and outside. The Liberals are the party of the center on this one, and this produces this odd situation in which the party of the kind of the party of the official language minority in whichever part of the country you're talking about, part of other things as well. And if you go back into the 19th century, you can actually sort of see the transformation. So what I've got here is this is it's constituency data where you've got census information. It used to be easy to get census information for constituencies because that's what the census was for, right? Elections Canada, bless its heart, has kind of brought us back to this world, but there is this gap in much of the 20th century which you just can't really do it. Actually, you probably could now thanks to software. But anyway, this goes back to, I've got you back to 1878, the first election fought on more or less competitive terms nationwide. These data were collected so long ago that Brenda O'Neill was the research assistant on this stuff. Anyway, the point is, pre-1900, 1900, 1911, 1970, and 21, right? There's a transformation as the parties are putting together bilingual or binational coalitions. Both parties are doing this. That actually both Blake, Laurier, and MacDonald worked really hard to suppress these kinds of divisions. Okay, but once you hit the 20th century, the divisions start to appear. But notice that this is Quebec and this is the rest of Canada. That the coefficients are the same, roughly speaking. That there's a positive relationship between the percentage francophone outside Quebec and inside Quebec and the Liberal vote, and a negative one for the Conservative vote. And then it gets even bigger with the conscription crisis and the war, right? So at that point, it's not Liberal Party as a center party with these really kind of flanking alternatives. It is a division over identity, which this is one of the markers, in which inside Quebec and outside Quebec, the fundamental structural properties of the competition are the same. The electoral significance of Quebec is that it's the biggest concentration of francophones, and even more importantly, I would say, the biggest concentration of Catholics. And that changes. Once we get back to available electoral data, so this is basically post-Second War, now you see the divergence, right? It's either in 1940 or 1935 or somewhere in there that the parties acquire this separate face inside and outside of Quebec. Okay? And it's in this period that the Liberal Party, in some sense, really becomes the really centrist party. Okay, a couple thoughts on Catholics in the party system, one of the great anomalies. Just a couple points to make. First of all, so here you'll see a table somewhat like this again in relation to an aspect of class politics. But the basic point is that the Catholic-non-Catholic difference, or the odds ratio of the two, is massive in 1965. For all the talk about the Canadian party system being lacking grounding in the social structure, it was just plain wrong. People were just unwilling to look for where the ducks were, because it was uncomfortable. It's the man who came to dinner, as Bill Irwin referred to it. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to go and talk with your American or Australian friends about them. So anyway, but the fact is that the gap between Catholics and non-Catholics was as wide, if not wider, than any comparable social difference in the Westminster world. Okay? It was the biggest. But of course, we didn't understand why. We couldn't make it go away with controlling for immigration. We couldn't make it go away. We couldn't make it go away with controlling for language or region of residence. It was just big and it was just there, and we didn't understand it. But we would make vague gestures towards the 19th century. Jesuit state school, blah, blah. Actually, we'll come back to that in a moment. But it's gone. It's just gone. And it was gone by the early years of this century. So the very point at which Andre Blais was giving his presidential address to take this as the great structural feature of Canadian elections and the key to liberal success, it was already gone. He's going to download and give me that prize, whatever it is. It was just gone. And I'll show you the time graph in a moment. So it's massive. We didn't understand it when it was there. And by the time that Andre tried to revive interest in it, it was gone. How can this be? So what's it about? Well, so again, 19th century data, where you've got the percentage Catholic in the constituents as well as percentage French. Let me just editorialize a little bit as a product of this very sociology. The notion that somehow the Catholic community outside Quebec is merely the extended shadow of Quebec itself, that it's just French in disguise, or even that it's Irish, as we should understand. 60% of the persons of Irish ancestry in this country are Protestants. That's a problem. Although it's also it's a very useful diagnostic factor in understanding what's going on here. But a very big fraction of the Catholic community, and a growing fraction of the Catholic community, comprises people who have no particular visible and obvious Catholicity about them. And case in point, I remember sitting around a table at the late lamented Embassy Tavern in Toronto with John Terry, some of you may remember John Terry's name, Tim Colton, now at Harvard, Don Forbes, retired at Toronto, and me, and we all fessed up that we were Catholics. John Terry, Don Forbes, Richard Gregory Chalmers, Johnston, what's the deal? We were products of the Nate Temery decree and the fact that anybody marrying a Catholic would have to raise the children Catholic. And so at the extreme, you had lots of people who had no particular visible green eyes, red hair, whatever. And that nonetheless were kind of pulled into a community with a particular center of gravity. Now, there are degrees of marginality within that community and so on. And I would present myself as quite marginal in that respect. But the point is, you gotta treat this in its own right, okay? For whatever it is, not just an aggregation of ethnicities. Though, I want to argue, it does go to the ethnic character of the identity of the country as a whole. Okay? That's what it's about. So if you go back to the 19th century, back to 1878, this is a period of intense sectarian strife. Okay? Jesuits' estates, massive protests and so on. Schools disputes and so on. All the kind of classic stuff of sectarian rivalry. The parties are essentially undifferentiated religiously. To the extent that they are differentiated, it's the conservatives do a little better amongst Catholics than the liberals do. But these confidence bands are all straddling zero. So the fact is, if you anatomize those disputes and those questions, what you see is the leaders of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, MacDonald, Quebec, Laurier, struggling mightily to keep the lid on. Okay? They're constantly beset on their flanks. They have within their coalitions difficult people, but they are not trying to stir it up. And this continues into the national schools crisis. You can almost feel sorry for Mackenzie Bowell, sometime Grand Master of the Ontario Orings Lodge, sitting in the cabinet with the current Grand Master of the Canadian Lodge and the leading Catholic layman at the same cabinet table. They were striving mightily to keep this stuff off the agenda because it was internally explosive, whatever else it was. Okay? The turning point, at least for the rest of Canada, is the 1900 election. And part of my argument is that 1900 is the trial run for the 20th century. 1900 is the South African War. There's, of course, other things going on, but this is when, for the first time, the government of Canada reluctantly, the Liberal government after all, reluctantly is involved in an imperial war. But it's a little war, and it's over. But it's a war that has echoes of the Canadian West, because amongst other things, there were the two mounted rifle brigades down there, heavily drawn from this part of the world, heavily made up of Protestant Irishmen who were equipped culturally to take other people's lands away. Here they were, they'd done it in the West pretty well, so now they're going to go do it in South Africa. So there's a sense in which this is an imperial theme where one's religious background is relevant to the susceptibility to the imperial appeal. Right? And Irish Canadians are, in that sense, perfectly diagnostic, because you can't just say Irish. Right? The political meaning of being Irish depends on which side of the fence you're on. That goes straight to the point. Now, that's a particularly sharp distinction, but you see sort of similar distinctions, somewhat more faded, for other groups. And then 1917, of course, is the big breakthrough. So you've got, if you do an all-Canada estimation, that means Quebec is in there. Clearly, part of what's going on here is Quebec versus the rest. Absolutely true. But even if you take Quebec out of the analysis and just focus on the impact of the percentage Catholic on the liberal share, and you get the flip side for the conservative share, it's a massive increase in the difference made by it, and it's essentially preserved in 1921. So this is a more general, and although there's still this kind of pious attempt to show that Catholic Irish were just as likely to be recruited as Protestant Irish and so on, it's just not true. It's very clear that recruitment rates, to the extent that there's evidence on religious affiliation, recruitment rates amongst Catholics are just way lower than amongst Protestants. There was an imperial dimension to the country's involvement in that war, and it's not just French English. And then if we proceed to the post-war period, so here we've got survey data. It persists, it seems to persist through to 1980, and then it collapses. It's actually a little bit misleading. If you control or take out Francophones, for example, or if you control for other ethnicities, what you see is that it really persists to 1965, that is, the religious difference as such. 1965 is, in some sense, the last great conflict of an imperial era. But it's, of course, the empire in Canada. It's the flag debate. Right? You have follow-on debates with content that somewhat overlaps that in the flag debate, education, integration of the armed forces, and so on. But the flag debate was the big symbolic one. And actually what's happening in here is that outside Quebec, this is Pierre Trudeau, who's the leader, so he rebuilt and then some the Liberal share inside Quebec. But outside Quebec, what was happening is that the Catholicism as such was waning. So French Canadians, Southern Europeans, very much on side with the Liberal Party, and jacking up the summary Catholic bivariate relationship. But in fact, theirs was now a much more explicitly ethnic identification for the party, and an ethnic identification in a period in which the identity margin has moved away from the British Empire and towards other stuff. Okay? And by the time you're out here, that identity margin is non-European ancestry, and that's the remaining pillar of liberal support. All the kind of historically Catholic European ancestries are indistinguishable from everybody else by this time. And in any case, even just the bivariate, when you hit the 90s, it's mostly gone. And so the summary argument is, it was an identity argument from the beginning. It was ethnic in character, but it wasn't the ethnicity of individuals. It was a combat over the ethnic character of the nationality, to which ethnicity is relevant, but also religion was relevant independently of ethnicity to the extent that Protestantism was part of the definitional character of criticism, and Catholicism was not. So I'm at, it's like have passed. Do you want me just to rush to conclude? Because I've got more slides. What do you want to do? I mean, your folks are going to have to split it.
Excuse.
Get an excuse? Okay. Well, so now to the volatility, right? Because you've got, so in some sense, you've got a party system that's evolving towards the Liberals at the party of the center on language stuff. And it's also kind of true on identity stuff more generally. Right? So that the Conservative Party is faced with this increasingly difficult challenge. That kind of electoral logic of survival has moved them in a sense in a more pro-British, anti-French direction outside Quebec, but to actually win, you got to get into Quebec. The Liberals are commanding the federalist end of the distribution in Quebec. The only way in which ultimately the Conservatives can get into power is by producing an ends against the middle coalition. And this doesn't give you direct evidence on it, but it's kind of indirect. So if you go to 1911, 1930, right, in both of those years, a critical element in the achievement of majority rule was the movement in Quebec. I mean, in 1911, the Conservatives would have won a small majority anyway, but their majority became a lot more comfortable because of this. In 1930, pretty much all the movement between 1926 and 1930 was in Quebec. That's what gave them his majority, almost nothing else. But notice that even though they're a weaker party than they were before Wilfrid Laurier came along, they're still getting sort of 40% in the early part of the century. They're still getting 30% after the war. And I can tell you that if you look inside the Quebec electorate, when the Conservatives grow in Quebec, how do they do so? They grow out from Anglo-Montreal. Right? So they essentially expand from the parts of the Quebec electorate that's most like the Conservative support base outside Quebec. That's no longer true after the Second War. So this is Beaver Baker, and this is Mulroney. Although the Conservative shares in Quebec are not that astonishingly high compared to earlier years, it's the gain required to get those shares. They're starting with a very low base and producing this extraordinary change. And then the base is even lower. The base is even lower after Diefenbaker, and yet an extraordinary surge in the vote. But of course, a surge which is unsustainable, it's gone after one election or two. And what's more, as the century progressed, produces an increasingly explosive dynamic around the Conservative Party. Right? So what I've done here is I've stylized each episode of surge and decline. So I won't dwell on the details, so you have to figure out what's the base, what's the peak, and what's the post. But if you so 1908-21, so out of power again, but in power for 10 years in the interim, out of power, in power, and then out. 53 is arguably the real baseline for the Diefenbaker era, because it took 2 iterations to get to majority rule. And 63, it took 2 iterations to get out of the government. So 50 to 63, and then last year for Trudeau, and then the Data of 93. So very modest surges required, and slightly bigger surge actually in Quebec than elsewhere, but it moved in both directions. But ultimate collapse, both inside and outside Quebec, for different reasons, however. Right? This is not so much cultural as economic. This is cultural. Almost the entire vote shift in Quebec collapsed in both places, but even bigger outside. Again, more economic than culture. And then Diefenbaker just won everywhere, won big everywhere, surged big everywhere. But the collapse was even bigger in Quebec than elsewhere. And then if you look at 80 versus 84, there's actually remarkably little change in the Conservative coalition outside Quebec between 80 and 84. It's a big shift. In Quebec, that's most consequential, although the Conservatives, again, would have had a majority in 84 without Quebec, but a very small one. But by 1988, Quebec was the pivot. Quebec sort of kept them in power. And then, of course, the massive collapse in both places. So whatever its anatomy, there has been this kind of explosive dynamic. And arguably, this explosive dynamic wrecked the old system. The Liberal government after '93, in one sense, seems a return to the old times. It's a very differently constituted electoral coalition, and not one that one could ever characterize as being kind of equilibrium. The division of the right being, in some ways, a big part of the story of Liberal success. The Liberals' own popular vote base was as narrow as Stephen Harper's is now. Am I going to carry on? And I want to talk about the fractionalization is the other sort of index number that then has its own story, takes us to the NEP. Can we do this? Hardcore political science, folks. All right. Okay. Well, Canada was the great challenge to Duverger's law, right? Duverger's law says that majoritarian electoral frameworks produce two-party competition. What has been now called Duverger's hypothesis is that more forgiving electoral frameworks at least permit multipartism, though they don't mandate it. That just wasn't true in Canada at the time that Duverger was writing. He knew this, he knows this. This is one place where actually the Canadian case was a big deal, respectfully treated in the comparative literature. And the argument that came out of this, essentially, this period here, in which, compared to, this is Australia there to kind of strengthen the comparison, compared to the first past the post countries, there was sort of like an extra effective party using the Boxer Tiger Fair Index compared to the others. Now, it's a little awkward that in the years since, the rest of the world has kind of joined us. But I'll leave that aside for now. So this is just a fact that was remarked 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and was struggled with. And the basic argument that came out of this was that you get national multipartism, but local bipartism, with different parties dominating contest in different places. Okay? So Duverger's law was saved at the constituency level, and that the coordination logic across constituencies was just a different logic. Okay? And that kind of logic didn't seem to work in Canada. Well, no. First of all, if you take the fractionalization of the Canadian party system apart, right? So one part is the local component. What's the average effective number of parties in a parliamentary constituency? You subtract that local component from the total, you get the extra local component. So this is a move that I basically copied from Pradeep Chibber and Ken Holm. And it's absolutely true that sectionalism is a big part of Canadian multipartism. Over the course of the century plus, it's about half the story. So a two-party system becomes a kind of four-party system, although maybe it's reconsolidating, but certainly kind of a four-party system in the noughts, in the 90s. Half the total shift, gain of a kind of equivalent extra party, is as a result of extra local considerations. Right? There's no question. We know this. Some of this is geographic differentiation in the major party appeals themselves, and other parts of this, new parties, third parties, the NDP, and so on. The problem is it's only half. The other half comes from somewhere else. And what's more, there are these odd moments. There are these points in which if you compare the sectional component post-1921 with the sectional component pre-1921, there are these four moments in which it seems to go away. These are all conservative majority governments. So this is picking up the fact that notwithstanding the powerful sectional forces, part of what's going on when conservatives actually win is they pull together the sectionalism, they absorb it, but it's a national phenomenon, not just a local one. A large part, of course, is Quebec, but it isn't just Quebec. It's also the Conservative Party being in a particular interaction with the others, with sectional parties in other parts of the country as well. And the other half, in any case, is the growth in the local. That if you look at the typical local contest, the effective number of parties used to be just under 2, which is kind of what you'd expect. Is, a competitive party system, there's going to be local bastions of strength, even in a relatively nationalized system. But if you compare this with the end of the day, local competition has gone from being sort of two-party competition to sort of three-party competition, and sometimes more than 3 parties, but on average, 3-party competition. Not supposed to happen. Also, notice that it's not. There's ups and downs, but there's a trend. It's a secular process. And what's more, the short-term stuff is actually diminished. It's a trend. It's qualitatively different from the other stuff. The other stuff is mainly cycles of insurgency, right? That other parties, when they enter, they don't tend to stick around, right? Particularly not in federal politics. When they stick around, it's more likely in provincial politics, because there's a provincial logic to sustain them, particularly if they become the alternative to the NDP or CCF. Okay? But in federal politics, there are powerful forces towards the elimination of insurgents. They don't fit into a parliamentary framework, and it's a prescription for frustration for the MPs, and voters kind of lose patience with it. And MPs start to move, and so on. And so there's a cyclical party. So it keeps recurring, new actors each time, but it is a phenomenon that's difficult to sustain indefinitely in the federal arena, where there are forces that are national in character militating against these. The NDP, on the other hand, has a different logic of contestation. So this is just uncontested seats for the three parties that I think of as the Westminster parties. In the 19th century, as parties congeal, there's a gradual decline in uncontested parties. This is also the displacement of local notables and all sorts of stuff. So by the time the old parties hit the 20th century, they're contesting most places. This period here is right around the 20s, a very unsettled period. The Liberals in particular did no competing agreements with progressives along the way. So, but basically, we're into a kind of fully contested world. The CCF was a Western party. It did have insurgent properties in that respect, even though it was also kind of a Labour party. Well, once the CCF becomes the NDP, contestation everywhere. Now, a lot of these are fake candidacies, and in due course, as electoral law, election finance changes, then these candidacies can almost pay for themselves. But oddly enough, fake candidacies become real ones. And this is part of the nationalization of the surface, so to speak. Even so, the NDP, until 2011 at least, never broke through. And I'll just, this other fact about the Canadian system that remains true, very weak class basis. If you do income or occupation, it's even weaker. The strongest indicator is union membership. I mean, even by that standard, it's a relatively weak effect. It's weak anyway. You calculate it, in spite of the fact that the union movement itself now, however difficult its times are, the density of the union movement, union density in Canada is higher than in the UK, New Zealand, or Australia, as well as in the US. So now don't blame it on the union movement here. There's something about the NDP itself. It's not that the NDP can't deliver, or rather, it's not that the union movement can't deliver. It's that the NDP can't deliver. If you actually look at the kind of impulse coursing through Canadian society, actually, for a party that is small, an impulse is it's not true. It's just that there's something else going on to block the party here. Here's a point about the union movement. If you look at the history of the growth of the NDP, so this black line is union density by province by decade. The gray line is the average NDP or CCF or NDP share in that province by decade. What you see is that the growth of the NDP is quite unrelated to the strength of the union movement. Meanwhile, the union movement is getting stronger everywhere. But the NDP is not getting stronger everywhere until you get sort of relatively recent decades. It was still a Western party. The constraint was arguably the percentage Catholic in the jurisdiction, so that the old systems are interacting with each other. But you can't just explain the weakness of the NDP by the weakness of the union movement. Actually, there's plenty of countries where the left party emerged before unions became an important phenomenon. Indeed, for many countries, success on the political left was the necessary condition for union mobilization. Though by the end of the century, everywhere, in general, the stronger the union movement, the stronger the party of the left. But it's not particularly useful as a historical explanation. I'm just going to... These slides, they'll just sort of just epitomize. You can't account for the weakness by reference to the places, just by a compositional argument referring to the places where the party is weak. So, for example, if you take the Canadian electorate and try to turn it into, say, the New Zealand electorate, but first, let's take out Quebec. That converts it to the Australian electorate. Then you take out Catholics, that converts it to the New Zealand factor, sort of like that. Even if you do that, yes, so this is all Canada survey data, all Canada, Canada without Quebec, the rest of Canada without Catholic, kind of like that. And there's no question that in the history of the party system, resistance by the church, the resistance by Quebecers, but especially by the church in Quebec, is hugely important in understanding barriers to the party's growth. So let's be clear about this, right? It's absolutely clear. But if you think of it as only a compositional argument, you don't get very far towards an explanation of the comparative anomaly. So that if you in our time, for example, if you look at that portion of the electorate, which is most like the New Zealand electorate, the size of the NDP is kind of somewhere between 20 to 30% of the vote. Right? Not between 40 and 50% of the vote. Not still where you gotta be to be a competitor for government. And I argue that this is one of these whole electorate things that if I want to argue that in some sense over the long haul of Canadian history, down to 2011 at least, that the weakness of the NDP in some sense is the logical flip side of Liberal strength, particularly as the Liberals become more like the NDP in policy terms. That the long-term credibility of the Liberals for government, which historically was predicated on their control of Quebec, though that's not true since '93, that this is still a subsisting barrier to NDP growth, or still a subsisting strategic advantage that the Liberals have, which they can play not just in relation to the NDP, but also in relation to Conservatives. Right? So the problem with that argument is it's really difficult to test. The one test I want to argue is a counterfactual test. It's an argument by interaction or contraposition. If that argument is true for federal elections, it shouldn't be true for provincial elections. And so that gets you some of the distance here. So if you just simply, this is a kind of polynomial regression of the provincial share on the federal share. What you see is that there's a much steeper relationship, or the relationship is flat down where the federal NDP is weak. They're even weaker in provincial elections. But where the NDP is strong in federal elections, they're even stronger. Okay? The hinge is somewhere in the teens. So that in provincial elections, the scale and scope of the federal Liberal Party just isn't relevant in the same way that historically it has been in federal elections. And then there's the 2000 election itself. This is in some sense the factual counterfactual. Quebec is the dynamic force. And this is just a plot of poll readings. So poll readings in Quebec as compared to the rest of the country for NDP vote intentions. Normalized to how the party did in the previous election. So what's the news here? What's the surprise value? And basically, the gains that the NDP made in Quebec anticipated those in the rest of the country, and certainly far exceeded those in the rest of the country, but they anticipated those in the rest of the country by a factor of about 2 weeks. Once it penetrated the consciousness of voters in the rest of the country that something was going on, and they didn't necessarily even read it as Quebec, the Canada share itself, because we're talking about a big share of the electorate with a big shift, it's in here, this period here, where all of a sudden Canada is looking to produce an NDP share that's 6, 7, 8 percentage points higher than in the previous election. Now they're in the 20s. They're actually nipping at the heels of the Liberal Party, and it continues to grow. But only later is there a serious move elsewhere. And the most serious move was in Ontario, because BC in some sense was already kind of there. But so I'm arguing that in some sense 2011 is the event that helps explain the preceding century in a bit, and underscores the critical nature of Quebec to the whole argument. Okay, the last exhibit. So this just goes back to the interactions between the new and the old parties, and that for the extra local, for the regionalization of the election, and for the flux down as well as up of the election, it's these other parties. It's the regional insurgents. Growth of the NDP is critical to the local fractionalization. The propagation of three-party competition across the nation is about the spread of the NDP. to a great extent. And it's an interesting question how long three-party competition is sustainable, but it's hung around for a long time. Of course, we're arguing about this right now. And this is the envelope. So I'm making an argument that involves competing dynamics in a single system. Because it's single-party governments, the various parts of the party system cannot compartmentalize their competition from each other in federal elections. Provincial elections are different. And in that respect, they also shed light on the federal. There is this ongoing pattern of nationalizing versus sectionalizing tendencies. That there's no question that where a sectional tendency expresses itself, the electoral system amplifies it. But there is a counter tendency that three of the parties all experience. If you want to form a government, you got to spread your support base. You have to be everywhere, but you can't be just in one place. Nationalization has involved three parties. Whether it's indefinitely sustainable, I don't know. But however long it has lasted for a long time, it has dire implications for models of strategic voting. And then there's a sub-theme here, which I haven't really developed, but it has to do with path dependency. That if I really wanted to get into the prairies, I would be, well, one, nationalist imagery, why the Liberals? Did it have to be the Liberals? Were the Liberals the only party that could play this game? I don't think so. I think it's somewhat accidental who got into power when and where at the critical moments. Secondly, though, a lot of the comparisons within regions, especially the prairies, I think path dependency explanations have to be resorted to. I mean, there are evolutionary cultural code tendencies, but you don't account for the origins of code. Right? You've got these kind of accidental sequences. So I say working on Myron Johnston, I think Myron's chapter on Alberta politics is really profound and needs to get reprinted somewhere. But there's a question about whether, in the long run, our functionalist considerations, e.g. classical, are they ultimately fated to prevail? How long can a path dependency sustain itself in the Westminster world? I'm done. Sorry for going on too long.
Okay, so